I want to thank you all for coming, first of all. I know there's other things to compete with this, and I hope you find this interesting and worth your while. I'm going to talk to you today about this little modest book that came out in 2013. Doesn't look like much, does it? But it's a monumental issue, and we're going to explore today what this book is about and what impact it has had and sadly has not had on the psychiatric profession. The book is called Saving Normal, and it's written by Allen Frances, MD. Many of you might know who he is, but the question to ask is, okay, why does that matter? Well, it matters because of who Allen Frances is. When we look at the title, Saving Normal, there's an implication there that there's something going on about psychiatric diagnosis and overdiagnosis. And this guy is about as mainstream and about as influential as you can be in today's psychiatric world. He is the Professor Emeritus and former chair of the Department of Psychiatry at Duke University, very prestigious job. He played a large role in developing DSM-3, which was the beginning of the medical model revolution in psychiatry, and also DSM-3R. And he's clearly what we call, and you hear this all the time, a thought leader and a prestigious and influential mainstream psychiatrist who also happened to be, and this is the most fascinating of all, the chairman of the DSM-4 task force. What does the chairman do when they come up with a new DSM? They decide what goes in and what doesn't. They influence the whole process. Allen Frances was in charge of DSM-4. In other words, he was a champion of this model of understanding human behavior, human psychopathology, and ultimately treatment. But here's the full title of the book. It's not just Saving Normal. The subtitle is An Insider's Revolt Against Out-of-Control Psychiatric Diagnosis, DSM-5, Big Pharma, and the Medicalization of Ordinary Life. And I just said, whoa, Allen Frances, what happened to you, man? I'm picturing him walking down the road like St. Peter, and a bolt of lightning hitting him, just a total conversion. In other words, an epiphany. He had an epiphany, and this is the source of that epiphany. I'll show you. This is the story he tells. He was pretty much retired. His wife had gotten ill, and he retired from active practice and being deeply involved in any of the major psychiatric decision-making. But he dropped into a party in San Francisco where some old colleagues would be a lot of heavy-duty psychiatrists, and the topic of the day was a DSM-5, the next edition of the DSM. And he heard from an enthusiastic old colleague about a proposed diagnosis in children and adolescents called psychosis risk syndrome, that children and adolescents could be identified who are at risk for future development of psychotic illness. And that sent good old Dr. Frances on the warpath. And now we're going to trace some of the reasons why that was. And if any of you get the newspaper, Psychiatric Times, which is a widely disseminated newspaper, there was a ongoing acrimonious debate by Dr. Frances against mainstream psychiatry in many issues. And he was just slaughtered, can I say, slaughtered. So it's just interesting that someone that was in such a position of responsibility and power, as soon as they objected to what the hell was going on, found himself with no power whatsoever. Nobody's ever heard this book. Nobody's ever read it. I don't know one psychiatrist that read this book. My conspiracy theory, it's not based on just paranoia. I think that the pharmaceutical industry suppresses publicity that are negative to their causes, because there was a book written in 2004 called The Drug Companies, How They Deceive Us and What We Can Do About It. And it was written by a lady named Marcia Angel. And Marcia Angel was at one time the editor-in-chief of the New England Journal of Medicine. In other words, she was in a position where the entire world was entrusting this woman to make logical, rational judgments about what should appear in that journal. Because that journal, it comes out on Monday, medical practice changes on Tuesday. It's a hugely influential journal, and she had that degree of prestige. And when she went after the drug companies, all her stuff completely true, she disappeared. Nobody heard about the book. I mean, they heard a little bit. She lost all of her power, and she's in a position where she's works in this community psychiatry department at Harvard. Writes things occasionally, but I think they keep track of what's going on and suppress television appearances and all those things.
What was the name of her book again?
It's I'll get it for you. It's drug companies. Yeah.
About how the drug companies deceive.
How they deceive us and what we can do about it. It's a subtitle, but I can't remember the exact name. Okay. Well, anyhow. I skipped a slide here. So Dr. Frances spelled out his intention. He's not like myself, and I think this is where there is some conflict sometimes here in this organization. I don't think that you just make psychiatry go away. I still think it has a place. And this is how he explains his position. He says, this book is my reaction to the excesses, part mea culpa, my fault, part your fault, and part critical is just a warning, you know. He's a bright guy. It provides an insider's despairing view of what has gone wrong and also offers a roadmap back to a safe and sane psychiatry. My goal is to not only save normal, but also to help save psychiatry. Psychiatry is a noble and essential profession, sound at its core and extremely effective when well done. Well, I don't know if I agree with that, but it is still a necessary profession. My critique is directed only against the excesses of psychiatry, not its heart and soul. Saving normal and saving psychiatry are really two sides of the very same coin. Psychiatry needs to be saved from rushing inward should fear to tread. Normal needs to be saved from the powerful forces trying to convince us that we are all sick. Okay, so here's his chapter titles from the book. First question that is in every introduction to every DSM, what's normal and what's abnormal? What is a mental disorder? The definitions stink. They remind me of, I'm going to get in trouble for this, asking a Republican senator a question that's never answered, you know, just circle, circle, circle. Then he goes from shaman to shrink, which he talks about how this profession evolved. A coin that he kind of termed diagnostic inflation. What is causing every DSM to have more diagnoses than the previous one? How does this happen? What's the phenomena? Then, as a warning for us, he looks at fads of the past, fads of the present, fads of the future, and then he makes some unaccomplishable recommendations regarding taming diagnostic inflation. That's my word, unaccomplishable. Talks a little bit about trying to reach the consumer, and then a few case histories. So I'll go through just some parts of this book with you. This is, of course, the core of the whole issue. It's impossible to accurately define normal, and therefore impossible also to clearly define abnormal. I mean, think about DSM diagnoses. What is required? There's always the word clinical in there. Clinically impaired, clinically significant, you know, deterioration in function, you know, value judgments from the very beginning, just to make the diagnosis whether someone has crossed that line from normal to abnormal. And not having a useful definition of mental disorder creates a gaping hole, no kidding, at the center of psychiatric classification, resulting in two unanswered conundrums: how to decide which disorders to include in the diagnostic manual, and how to decide whether a given individual has a mental disorder. And these are wide-ranging decisions with multiple implications in all aspects of life and culture. Here's what I try to tell my patients, and we still do not have a single diagnostic test in psychiatry, diagnostic laboratory test. The absence of biological tests is a huge disadvantage for psychiatry. I think it negates psychiatry as a medical science. If you don't have something that's incontrovertible proof of something that would be agreed upon by all people in all cultures in all parts of the world, like cancer diagnoses and things, then you don't have a science. It means that all our diagnoses are now based on subjective judgments. They're inherently fallible and prey to capricious change. Well, we all know that. And I might add, this is from me, it makes it impossible for psychiatry to be anything more than a pseudoscience, or at best, or as Neil McLaren in our own journal, so aptly labels it bullshit. Yes?
In layman's terms for me, can you explain, when you say there's not a single laboratory test in psychiatry, that's blowing my mind.
Yeah. You've seen all kind of articles about functional MRIs. You know, well, first of all, I lived in the era when they were doing things like dexamethasone suppression tests and tests on the thyroid gland, and they thought they had the marker for biological depression versus environmental depression, or endogenous versus exogenous was the idea. And they went through these series of things and they found some abnormalities, but the longer they were around, the more they were proven to be useless. So there were no blood tests that defined whether someone had a so-called endogenous depression, meaning the depression that arose from within, not from outside circumstances. Here's an interesting point. Nobody gives a damn about that anymore. There's no such concern as endogenous versus exogenous. There's no concern about environmental stressors. You know, this is my highlight of my experience with Allen Frances was at a meeting that I went to where they were there defending DSM-4, and I raised my hand and I said, well, what about all the other causes of people getting depressed? He says, oh, that's why we have Axis 4. Do you remember the Axis diagnoses? Axis 4 was environmental stressors. And nobody cares about Axis 4. All they cared about was Axis 1. So if you were major depression, you were major depression. Yeah.
What about vitamin D levels?
The what?
Vitamin D levels?
Well, I mean, there are many things that can cause mental health problems, but this distinction between biologically based mental illness versus not biologically based mental illness, in other words, definitive case of bipolar disorder, here it is, here's the gene mapping, here's the functional MRI, something that prove it, does not exist. You can have all kind, I mean, you know, drug addiction creates all kind of psychiatric symptoms. You know, they're hung up on symptoms. So I just want to read you this definition of bullshit because I like it so much. Okay, now bullshit is neither true nor false, but is designed to create a particular impression in the audience. For example, the lack of a valid means of getting from the mental to the physical is no deterrent to the belief. All psychiatrists know, all mental health professionals know that we don't have a language or certainly any theory or any understanding of how this mush of neurons with its trillion connections and thousands of neurotransmitters and subtype receptors and all these things we've discovered, how that results in what we experience as subjective consciousness, as emotion, as thought. There's just no understanding of that whatsoever. There's no language to it. You know, the 90s was the decade of the brain. Guess what? Failure. They didn't come up with what they were hoping for. You know, where's the God neuron? Where's the violence neuron? What neurons can we find to predict someone's going to be a psychopath? None of this is happening. Yeah, Al?
Yeah, there's a neuroscientist named William Udall. Wrote a book called Mind and Brain, a critique of neuroscience.
I've read it.
And basically, you know the book, and he said, you know, neuroscientists think they have a theory about how the brain creates the mind. They're not even close.
No, there is
I mean,
none.
they're so far away, it's not even close. The mind is such a vast faculty, so powerful, so amazingly facile and powerful.
And mysterious.
You have no idea how the brain...
Yeah. I compare it to the scientific theories about the universe, okay? We have all these wonderful theories about the universe, but all of us know there's a few things missing. First of all, the concept of infinity just doesn't work. Okay, the universe is finite. What's beyond it? When did it start? What happened before it started? So we get things like string theory and the most ridiculous theory in my mind, the Big Bang theory. We're not going to understand the universe, and we're not going to understand, ever, mind-brain. We're not. It's too complicated. It's too mysterious. Maybe it is just God-given and let it go. You know, it's not going to happen. Okay. What he did when he went from DSM-3 to DSM-4 was try to be more scientific, which is an interesting concept since you don't have a science. I don't know how you can be more scientific. Every time you hear something in mental health that says studies show, look at that with a jaundiced eye. There's no such thing as a study in a non-science. It's more like case histories and things, maybe they have more validity, but this idea that there's scientific evidence, but that's what they look for. And of course it exists. There's tons of studies. That's where all the research money goes, into biological studies. So they carefully defined things like ADHD, and actually expected by doing that there'd be a slight increase in the percentage of people diagnosed, but they forgot they were living in America. He said, we couldn't have foreseen the abrupt switch in reality that occurred in 1997 when drug companies brought new and expensive medications to the market and were simultaneously set free to advertise them directly to parents and teachers. Soon the selling of ADHD was ubiquitous in magazines, on your TV screen, and in pediatricians' offices. And an unexpected epidemic was born, and the rates of ADHD tripled, not up a mere 15%. I say, this is from my private practice. This is one-year period of the things I received in the mail from the people who make Adderall, okay? These are very expensive. A lot of them had CDs inside or DVDs. Once I tried to start a seminar and I had to advertise with a little plain booklet, and it was like $10,000 just to mail enough of them to reach an audience that might come to the talk. And here you have these companies with unlimited budgets, really. And this is just 1 year's worth of stuff that comes in the mail, these multicolored, bright, cleverly designed and labeled, with the models and everything. And they also use a tactic that has become an extremely successful tactic in America, using fear to sell something. And this is the kind of stuff they would send to us. Adults with ADHD, they're, by the way, trying to create the adult ADD market, not the kids. That's already well established. Now we have to have a whole new population, adults with ADD. They are more likely to have been involved in 3 or more car crashes. Adults with ADHD were 3 times more likely to be unemployed. Adults with ADHD were nearly 2 times more likely to have been divorced. My God. And we didn't recognize this epidemic of ADHD in adults. And how do you diagnose that? Do you have a hard time concentrating? Yeah, sometimes my mind wanders and I really have a hard time focusing. And I feel distracted because there's so much going on around me. I just feel like I'm just out there. Well, I have some crystal methamphetamine for you. Oh, it's called Adderall, but it's the same drug, only it was produced by a pharmaceutical company. And that should very well help you focus. And by God, it did. But that's even still not a big enough market. So let's do this. Let's take another diagnosis and say that what really underlies that diagnosis is the condition for which you have the drug. And I set this up because you'll notice this is you can't see it, but it's a folder. And you see on the one corner it says, from the desk of Dr. Phillip Sinaikin. In other words, they printed up memo pads for every doctor in the country and sent them this thing to try to induce them to think about asking depressed patients if maybe they had some of the symptoms of ADHD. This is going on. This is extremely influential. This is so much more powerful than us. It's just, well, I'll say it again. What sold this latest political upheaval in our country was fear-mongering. It works, and advertising. Okay, now he said, fine, disease mongering is the fine art of selling psychiatric ills as the most efficient way of peddling very profitable psychiatric pills, and they are. Manipulating the market is particularly easy in the United States because we are the only country in the entire world that allows drug companies to advertise directly to consumers. New Zealand was the last one before us, and they stopped it. No other country in the world allows this manipulative crap to end up on TV, convincing you that you need a particular drug. And with all I think the greatest minds in this country are in marketing, because that's where the money is selling an image. And they have these people in these pictures and the clouds over the head and the clouds disappearing. And you take, the new drug Latuda. If you're a bipolar depression, and by God, the clouds lift, the sun shines, and life is wonderful. And this is, okay, here's a classic example from a long time ago. This was the beginning of the domination of Paxil, but this is for Zoloft. This is she just shy, or is it social anxiety disorder? And then you have Terry Bradshaw, the quarterback for the Pittsburgh Steelers, on TV selling Paxil. What drug companies do is, and this is what the DSM plays a central role, they will take a diagnosis in DSM, they will run studies on it, drug versus placebo, and if you want to read about that in detail, I actually, the article in the bulletin I wrote about placebos and how that results in people taking psychiatric drugs for life. But they do these studies, and if they get FDA approval, they're free to go with it. They can't do it for something they didn't get approval for. Well, there's a lot of diagnoses in there. Like we got a new one, binge eating disorder. Who's going to grab that one and do studies? Because they will become identified as the drug that particularly treats that condition. And initially it was Paxil, but then the other companies say, how many Paxils are they selling for social anxiety disorder? Maybe we better do $30, $40 million worth of studies, which is what it costs to do 4-phase studies, and then get the indication and then advertise and try to cut into that market. Everybody thinks there's a drug that's particularly good for OCD. Have you heard that? There's a drug called Luvox that's particular for OCD. That is just, Luvox is an old antidepressant from Europe that came to this country. When you come to this country, you have to pass muster with the FDA. And they just couldn't get 2 studies to show it was better than placebo in depression. They couldn't. But they did get one that showed, they did get 2 studies showing it's better than OCD in depression, better in OCD than placebo, and they went after that market. It's just another serotonin reuptake inhibitor, but it gets identified as the drug of choice for OCD because of these factors, not anything has to do with factual reality. Okay, so he's identified this problem. Diagnostic inflation has many, many causes and will require many cures. Psychiatric fads start when a powerful authority gives them force and legitimacy. The DSM system and the experts, including himself, who fashioned it, have been the main fashion setters. They do have what they call thought leaders in psychiatry. You see that all the time. This was a horrible example of the dissemination of false information. It was the cover of Time magazine. It was a while ago. It was an 11-page article presenting as factual and non-controversial the existence of diagnosable bipolar disorder in children as young as 2 years old and the need for multiple medication cocktails to treat it. And then I say, Rebecca Riley, rest in peace. She's a little 3-year-old girl who was overdosed on, I think it was clonidine. The doctor, she was on bipolar medication, I think Depakote or something like that, plus she was on another medicine, but if she was too agitated, they said give her an extra dose of clonidine, which is a blood pressure pill. It has some calming properties. Well, they gave her too much and she died. Parents are in jail. The psychiatrist, no penalty. And Time magazine,
They gave her immunity to testify against the parents.
No, she was dead.
No.
Oh.
The psychiatrist was given immunity.
Yeah, it was terrible, tough. It wasn't, some fly-by-night psychiatrist, tough university. But this article just blew my mind. It was absolutely, they go to a guy named George Papalis, who is the director of the Childhood Bipolar Disorder Center at some university, and expect to get both sides of the story from someone like that. Well, of course you're not going to. You could go and find other voices to the contrary, but Time magazine didn't bother. So here we have a very influential magazine, cover story, cute little kid. Everybody in here had different meds that worked and different meds that didn't work, and they were on terrible things like Risperdal. And all this started because there was a psychiatrist at Harvard named Joseph Biderman who was on the payroll for Risperdal, who advanced the concept that some of these kids that we think are ADHD are really bipolar. And then they start with the fear-mongering. And if we don't catch it early, there's a higher degree of suicide, a higher degree of substance abuse, a higher degree of criminal activity, dropping out of school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Scare the hell out of the parents. This is how these epidemics are. I mean, it doesn't come just from the DSMs. It has to be disseminated. It has to be popularized. It has to be brought to the public. And who's not going to believe these MD, PhD big shots, director of this and director of that? Okay, some causes of diagnostic inflation. DSM's excessive importance. Well, that's already a known. It just runs everything. Courtrooms, hospitals, way beyond classrooms, way beyond just the psychiatrist's office. Easy to use drugs. I mean, they weren't treating depression with medication when it was imipramine and Elevil with toxicity and potential for death and overdose. But boy, when Prozac came along, that was the beginning of dissemination of this to the entire population. You can't kill yourself with an overdose of Prozac. You can kill others with a single dose of Prozac, or yourself, but that they don't talk about. Disease mongering by Big Pharma, placebo response sells pills. I mean, you're given a drug that's called an antidepressant. You're in a miserable state for whatever reason. Time heals, people heal, things heal, explanations heal. People love the idea that it's a brain disease. Let's face it. You got all these problems. You're irritable. You can't sleep. Your marriage is not doing well because you're such a pain in the ass. You're not doing well at work. Thank God it's not me. It's my brain. That has a lot of appeal. And primary care takes over diagnosis and treatment. Now, when I go to my primary care office, there's about 5 examination rooms with charts hanging on the door. The doctor wants to get through with everybody in about 45 minutes to an hour, if that long, with those 5 people. So you go in and you see your patient who you've been managing their rheumatoid arthritis, and they start crying. Gotta get out of here. What's wrong? I don't know. I'm just crying all the time, and I don't care about anything anymore. Whoa. Here's some medication. Here's a sample pack, and then here's a prescription for 11 months. I'll see you then. This'll work. Off you go. I mean, it's a wonderful thing for the primary care people. And they have little 5-item checklists in the waiting room where you can check off the core symptoms of major depression and diagnose yourself before you even get in there. No need to talk to you. I don't have the time to sit down and talk to you about your marriage. Just take the pill. It's reality. Okay. Just to show you a little bit about diagnostic inflation, and I did not have to dig into my records. I didn't have to go looking for a particular case. It's a couple of people I'm seeing now, and this is typical. This is their diagnosis. 54-year-old male, adult attention deficit disorder, anxiety disorder, alcohol dependence, adjustment disorder, recurrent depressive disorder, mood disorder, unspecified personality disorder, anxiolytic dependent, dysthymic disorder, and bipolar disorder. What bothers me is this is acceptable. Do you understand? Nobody stood back and said, what? Who put this BS together? Nobody can have all these things at once. What are you talking about? They don't even jive. Adjustment disorder means it's not biological, but depressive disorder means it is. And bipolar disorder moves up and down, and dysthymia is depressed. And what about all the alcohol and all these secondary effects of being an alcoholic? Nobody questions it. They just keep adding up. Here's another one, 37-year-old male. Unspecified depressive disorder. That's what's great. You don't have to follow the criteria. You can still make a diagnosis. In fact, people don't give a damn about the criteria. I'll be honest with you, in clinical practice, nobody has a checklist of the criteria, except for PTSD, but that's because there's money involved. Rule out PTSD. This is a very, very definitive diagnosis, huh? Unspecified depression, rule out PTSD, and then in comes the drugs, alcohol, stimulants, methamphetamine, opiates, traumatic brain injury by history. Oh, there we go. That throws everything to complete disarray. Unspecified personality disorder. That means something that started in childhood and adolescence, maladaptive patterns of coping with antisocial traits. Nicotine use disorder, cannabis use disorder, garbage is what we used to call them. History of bipolar disorder. I'm not quite sure what that means, since that's supposed to be a chronic disease, and childhood ADHD. And I didn't have to dig for these. You understand? They're just there. It's not. Maybe these were a little bit on the ones on the heavy duty side, but not much, really, not much. So that's diagnostic inflation. What are some of the consequences? Well, the consequences are childhood bipolar disorder increased 40-fold. So now young children, instead of being on Ritalin, are on Risperdal. Growing breasts. Nice for the boys, you know, they get these little boobs because you get hyperprolactinemia with Risperdal. And the whole idea that you don't get tardive dyskinesia from atypical antipsychotics is not true either. People do. We just don't learn from history, but that's not new. Autism went up, and adult bipolar disorder doubled. The biggest puzzle is the huge success of antipsychotic drugs. $18 billion annually versus $12 billion on antidepressants. Antipsychotics developed for the treatment of schizophrenia, at best a condition that people would say affect 1% of the population. Well, this is a big market. That's more than just 1%. Despite their dangerous side effects and narrow indications, they are being given out like candy. Annual advertising budget for Abilify and Seroquel, $2.4 billion. Here's what these guys did. They said, okay, schizophrenia is not a good enough market. What about bipolar disorder? Let's do hospital-based studies of manic patients and treat them with Abilify versus placebo, and ta-da, the major tranquilizer calmed down the manic patients. Whether they really work over the long run, nobody really knows. You know, they don't follow it long enough. You only need to do studies for like 6 weeks, and then you get an indication for bipolar disorder. Well, the bipolar disorders they're treating are classic bipolar type 1, severe mania with psychosis. That's why they're in the hospital. But the bipolar diagnosis has been stretched now to anybody who complains of moodiness. What's your negative mood? I get so pissed off at things, I just lose it. You know, and these are soldiers, no kidding. And they're diagnosed bipolar. They now will consider aggression and temper, the manic side. Time frames don't matter anymore. Doesn't matter if it's, you know, rapid cycling. They now moods up and down during the day. Rapid cycling was originally defined as 4 episodes of bipolar disorder per year, which is, by the way, rare. Now that was bastardized into the concept of moods up and down throughout the day. You're bipolar. It's a great diagnosis because it covers just about everybody you see. It just depends how you ask the questions. Do you have periods of time in your life when you feel more energetic and need less sleep and are more creative and think more and talk faster? And you're asking somebody, you know, to rerun the tape of their life, and they'll go, yeah, I guess so. Oh, okay. How long do they last? Do they last, I don't know, a couple days maybe, I don't know, maybe a day. Maybe 4 days? Yeah, I guess, you know. Oh, good, you qualify for diagnosis of bipolar type 2. We'll now get out the mood stabilizers and kill you. They're very dangerous drugs. There's some side effects we're warned about with these drugs that no one pays any attention to. Depakote, along with its capacity for liver toxicity and other problems, it can create a condition called acute hemorrhagic pancreatitis, which by the time you are symptomatic, you're dead. And Depakote can cause that. Lamictal can cause Stevens-Johnson syndrome. It's a black box warning. Stevens-Johnson syndrome is an autoimmune response to your body's own skin and mucosal membranes, which start to fall off you, like a burn victim. You die a horrible death. But hey, Lamictal indicated for the treatment of bipolar disorder, so let's give that a try. We don't have to give serum levels, and we don't have to watch your liver or your blood count. We just have to warn you that you might, if you get a rash, here's what the doctors do say. If you get a rash, just let me know. You know, let me know if you get a rash, because that's the beginning of the, now if you look at the black box warning carefully, it says that even if you stop the medication, the rash can continue to progress into Stevens-Johnson syndrome, even though, so there's no quick answer. So you call your doctor, why? It's kind of like the 4-hour erection, call your doctor. No. Go to the emergency room. Or you could end up with a blood clot in your penis that has to be surgically removed and have a disfigured, non-functioning penis the rest of your life. They said, call your doctor. I love that. You know, call your doctor, ask your doctor. So there's some really nasty side effects with these drugs. Now here's the latest trend with Seroquel. Seroquel comes in all kinds of sizes, way down to 25 milligrams, up to 600 milligrams a day for this drug. It is indicated for the treatment of schizophrenia. It is what's called a second-generation antipsychotic. But the VA at least has decided we're getting rid of benzos. We're no longer going to dispense benzos for many reasons. Most of them, I think, probably along the lines of we don't want some article in the newspaper saying VA drugging soldiers into complacency or VA addicting soldiers to benzodiazepines. they got very sensitive to that. So they went on a real negative campaign about benzos. But, a lot of our guys were taking the benzos to calm this anxiety that they had that was, from the combat trauma experience or sexual trauma experience. And it was working in its own way. I mean, I don't know what you want to call working, but my patients would tell me, if I can't go to Walmart to save my life, but if I take a Xanax, I can go to Walmart, or I can leave the house, or, I don't feel like there's, bombs going off outside the door. And they thought it was good, which is kind of interesting because that's the marker of efficacy in psychiatry is patient subjective report. I've had many patients that the only thing that's ever helped me is Xanax. I've been on this, I've been on that. And they want it. But we said no. We had to say no. We weren't officially told, by the way. It's very insidious at the VA. You're a private practitioner. You make your own decision, but we strongly advise you not to. As I said, you want me to take these Vietnam vets off of Xanax who have been on it for 30 years, and you want me to tell them now that it's a dangerous drug that can kill them? Why don't you give me an official paper from the VA, a position paper, that I can hand them so it doesn't become personal? But no, they don't do that. Oh, we won't do that. You have to work with each patient as an individual. And then the patients will get pissed off at me personally because they want their Xanax. Now, I have kept a good portion of my Vietnam vets on their benzos, but I'm leaving practice and my patients are being distributed to other doctors, so now they're pissed at me because they have to get them off the benzos. And they do. They give them 25 milligrams Seroquel to take throughout the day. That's the new minor tranquilizer. Interesting, because Seroquel is a member of a group called major tranquilizers, for psychosis. And now they're giving them that just to kind of knock it down a little bit. Not nearly as, we know exactly how benzodiazepines work, but we don't know how these drugs work. But we won't give them that one that targets specifically the source of the sympathetic outflow from the central nervous system. We give them one that just kind of dampens the brain. And they're doing it. They're taking Seroquels. It's terrible. Okay, now, polypharmacy. This is where I really believe my profession has gone completely around the bend. Seriously. They have lost any semblance of a logical, organized medical specialty, and they've just become hip shooters, shooting from the hip, whatever. You didn't like this one? Try this one. And let's add this, and let's add this, and let's add this. And I see so many people on these multiple drug cocktails. They don't even make sense. So once again, I just pulled a couple cases. Nothing special. I didn't have to look for it for a month. Here's a 46-year-old with a diagnosis of PTSD. Current meds: Xanax, Trazodone, Ambien, Depakote, Risperdal, oxycodone, and testosterone. I wonder if he knows who the hell he is. He's just, these are, okay, but that's current meds. Past med trials, I'm not even going to read them. Every class of drug for every possible indication he's been put on. Well, what do we think is wrong with this guy, and what are we trying to fix? No, what we're trying to do is address their complaints, do something, and move on to the next patient. Not a whole lot different than the primary care docs. Get them out of my office. They have such complex problems. They have such deeply rooted problems, and they've been in experiences that none of us should ever endure, these combat trauma experiences. And we're just like throwing drugs at them like a moron, like we don't have any education and we have no basis from which we're deciding. There's no basis for the med trials this guy's been on. He's been on med trials for ADD. He's been on med trials for bipolar disorder. He's been on med trials for depression. He's been on med trials for psychosis. He's been on med trials for insomnia. What are we doing? And this is real. These are real cases. I see these people. They come in there. They're my patient. I just shrink. And the drug changes are made wholesale and rapidly. Here's a guy that was on our inpatient psychiatric unit, discharged on Wellbutrin, Cymbalta, so that's 2 antidepressants, gabapentin, which doesn't have any psychiatric indications, but people think helps with anxiety. Seroquel, you know what that is. Requip, which is for restless leg syndrome, and if you ever want to get a little entertainment, read the side effects of Requip. Requip may lead to foolish spending of money, sexual acting out, and all these things that you would get in trouble for, like in Las Vegas, you can blame on your Requip because that's an actual reported side effect. And trazodone. Okay, so here he is. He's sent from the inpatient unit to the dual diagnosis program. And there, his medication is changed to zolpidem Lyrica, which is for peripheral neuropathy, Wellbutrin, Cymbalta, so stayed on the antidepressants. They added Buspar for so-called anxiety, Prazosin, which is a blood pressure pill they use for nightmares, Lamictal for bipolar, Seroquel, and melatonin. Just in this 130-day hospitalization, his entire treatment was changed. And here's the thing, they don't get better, okay? I might really actually be able to believe some of this if they got better, but they don't get better. We just shift around the symptom package and their complaints. And we have to deal with the fact that there's a lot of money involved. If you're 100% service connected for PTSD, you get $4,000 a month from the United States government for the rest of your life. You don't have to work, no taxes, health insurance and dental insurance for you and your whole family. In our dental clinic, if you're 100% service connected, you'll get implants if you lose a tooth. If you're not 100% service connected, all they'll do is pull it. They won't do anything else. They won't do any restoration at all. So there's a lot. Okay, briefly, let's see how my time is. Okay, fads of the past, just to learn. Can we learn from history? Neurasthenia, hysteria, multiple personality disorder was a big deal back when Freud was formulating his theories. It had a revival later. And then if all of us remember that daycare sex abuse scandal, when that whole group of people that worked at daycare centers were accused of satanic rituals, of bizarre, sadistic sexual behavior with young children, of which there was no physical evidence whatsoever. And it was very much compared to the Salem witch trials. They would get one kid to talk about it, then they would influence the next kid. And these were lawyers and cops and judges, and it was just, that was a fad of the past. You don't see that nowadays. Current fads, attention deficit disorder, certainly the adult, childhood bipolar disorder, autism becomes fashionable. They introduced Asperger's in DSM-4, now they took it out at DSM-5. The biggest problem, bipolar 2, was an effort to label people who had major depressive episodes but had hypomanic episodes, 4 days of excessive energy and creativity and flight of ideas, but not really psychotic. They didn't really do destructive things. In fact, in many ways, they think they did constructive things. But that has been bastardized now into this idea that I discussed previously. Just any kind of mood swings is called bipolar disorder. Major depression, not always so major. Social phobia, PTSD, hard to get right for lots of reasons, but too much to talk about here. Fads of the future, turning tantrums into psychiatric disorder. There's a new diagnosis in DSM-5 about kids who have bad tantrums, what their mental disorder is. The forgetting of normal aging becomes mild neurocognitive disorder. So it doesn't imply that you're becoming demented or going to have Alzheimer's. It's just like me, who had to go back up to the room to get the book to show you, which I forgot. Gluttony, binge eating disorder, I think it's one binge a week or maybe one binge a month for 3 months in a row. A binge being eating more than you intended, feeling stuffed and guilty, like any dieter that ever lived. They're calling that a binge eating disorder, and now they want to treat you with meds. Mourning is confused with melancholia. They no longer, in one DSM, if you remain depressed after 6 months after the loss of someone, you could label them major depression and treat it as an illness. Then in DSM-4, it was 2 months. Now it's no months. Now it's, if you have the symptoms of major depression, even if it's related to grief, you get treated. Turning our passions into addictions. Internet addictive disorder, porn addictive disorder. I don't know what they're going to do. Well, they could treat that with SSRIs because then you can't orgasm, so why look at porn? But that's the sexual side effects of SSRIs are horrendous. They just ignore that completely. They don't even tell patients it's coming. and they'll be unable to orgasm or unable to sustain an erection or unable to have a libido. They're very powerfully negative influence on our sex life. Dodge bullets, psychosis, Rick's syndrome, and hepaphilia is a feeling of sexual attraction to teenagers. And at least this is what I liked about Allen Frances. He was much nicer in the book than in person, but he would joke about, hey, who doesn't think a teenager has a nice body? You know, that doesn't mean that you don't act on it. You just think that's hot, you know. And why we want to call that a mental disorder? So these are things that might be coming in the future. Okay, here's where I think it becomes naive and sad, because this is what he thinks we can do to tame diagnostic inflation. Redirect the war on drugs onto medications, and medications that are harming people, instead of spending all of our time and money worrying about marijuana and cocaine and heroin. Tame big pharma. No more direct-to-consumer advertising, no more junkets, no more dinners, no more CME support or financial support for professional advocacy groups, no more co-opting of thought leaders, etc. We will not even be able to pass the most minor gun restriction in this Senate after that horrible slaughter in Las Vegas. How are we going to pass legislation to reduce the influence of the pharmaceutical industry on their consumer base, which are the doctors and the patients? Sunsetting bad drugs, just getting rid of things like Buspar that's purely placebo, and just stop having people spend money on it. Taming the doctors. Now maybe there's a little hope there for taming the doctors. And another interesting concept he has is that the DSM should not be in the hands of psychiatrists. There's too much self-interest there. Put it in the hands of a multidisciplinary committee. Can't imagine that committee, and redo the DSM with input from multiple groups, including, important groups like feminists and LGBT community, and those people having some input into these things, and psychologists who have only psychologists that follow DSM can be involved. If you argue against it, you imagine the analysts came up against DSM-3 and they lost. Here's something I didn't make a slide of that I think is maybe a source of hope. And this has to do with educating the psychiatrists. And this was a quote from Allen Frances also. Prematurely resorting to medication short circuits the traditional pathways of restorative natural healing. Seeking support from family, friends, and the community, just like that wonderful talk yesterday morning. Making needed life changes, offloading excessive stress, pursuing hobbies and interests, exercise, rest, distraction, a change of pace. Overcoming problems on your own normalizes the situation, teaches new skills, and brings you closer to the people who were helpful. Taking a pill labels you as different and sick, even if you really aren't. If that argument could be made, if you could get the psychiatrists to start feeling guilty about what they're participating in, maybe that would have some effect. I don't know, maybe consumer education, but of what nature? How do you fight big pharma? Okay, consumer and provider education. What are we up against? It's interesting. I made this slide a long time ago. It was mentioned yesterday. It's a David and Goliath thing. It is Goliath. It's incredible. It's frightening, but the power that the mainstream psychiatry and big pharma have and share together. Okay, this was my mantra when I first read it. It was actually in one of our bulletins where Dr. Cohen, David Cohen, was interviewing various upcoming speakers, and one of them was Robert Fancher. And here's what he said. The intellectual work of exposing the false claims of the psychiatric mainstream has been well accomplished, and it has changed almost nothing. Despite all of the august and trenchant criticism of DSM-5, for instance, there it is in place, governing research and care. That's I have shelves full of wonderful books. Ritalin Nation, Prozac Nation. I mean, there's just one book after another. Mad Science, recently published by Dave Cohen and Kirk, from Kirk and Cutchins. I mean, great books, totally valid arguments, having no impact. So for a while I said, okay, you know what? I actually called Bob Fancher. I said, well, what are you going to do? He says, I'm just going to retire. I can't wait. And I'm done with it. He plays bass in a band. He's going to go play. I play trombone in a band. I said, that sounds like a good idea. Then I listened to this guy, Al Franken. I would recommend this to anybody who's interested in politics and a wonderful human being. It's his latest book, just wrote it a few months ago. And you got to get it on tape. Don't read it. Let him read it to you. It's just wonderful. The crap he's gone through, those Senate races, the dirt, it was unbelievable. He wrote a satirical, he was a comedian. He wrote a satirical comedic article for Playboy that talked about rape. And the next thing you know, he's being labeled an advocate of rapists in the campaign he ran against, of course, a Republican. So at the end of it all, I mean, things are about as bad as they could be in Washington right now. He said, don't give up. And he said it in such a way, I swear to God, I don't spontaneously cry very often. I was bawling in the car. It was so inspirational. So that's why I'm here. Thank you, Al Franken. I actually wrote to him, never heard from him. So we just can't give up. Just keep pounding away, and maybe things will get better. I don't know how, but maybe things will get better. I mean, I have 20 psychiatrists at the VA that I work with. 19 of them are biological psychiatrists whose first note in their progress note is, on our last visit, we decided to increase trazodone and change from Celexa to Prozac. That's their note. Then the rest is all a bunch of BS, but that's their note. And I don't know what you do with people like that. They're certainly not criticized by the VA or their boss. Okay, I know I didn't leave time for discussion, but I'm shocked I got through this. So I'm not trying to sell books, but it's a complex issue, and it's laid out in its complexity, including its philosophical underpinnings in my book, Psychiatry Land. It's hard to answer questions without going into, it's very deep. It has to do with the entire Western concept of truth and reality is where we're up against. We're done. Okay, thank you very much. Thanks for coming.